Hello everyone, today we talk about medieval Berry for our historical regional series dedicated to the Middle Ages in particular. It's a while that we don't look at the Kingdom of France in it. Definitely we got to the point where we covered some of the most important regions in Europe, at least among the most important, and also a substantial amount of the secondary ones. Naturally, the series is never simply going to end or wane even. However, we will get perhaps more in depth to this stuff through a more evidential history of the characters that at that point becomes both local as biographical. De facto, you can look at it in the medieval England playlist, because we, for example, made lots of videos about Edward I. Arriving to sovereigns like him, you can't but, of course, dedicate a long time to them, especially for, naturally, a country like England, whose monarchy was one of the most developed and powerful of the time. So, in that sense, it does make sense. For France, it's a bit the same, because it's fundamentally a history, a monarchic history, and or one of higher nobility at the end of the day. It's true that the south is slightly different, but here in Berry, so if you look at the center, at the north, in general, there is sort of another narrative that we have highlighted, not just for France, but also in this case, for the broader, say, dynamics of medieval European, or also, in fact, even world process of disgregation, recomposition, crisis with further disgregation, and gradual loss of autonomy of these smaller elements that at some point hadn't made it to become significant princely powers. They had essentially become, especially with the rise of the Capetians, some appanage, some kind of at least feudal entities subjugated to the broader powers of the land. That's why I was saying before that we have to skirt a bit around the bigger regions / powers that we already covered at some point, but we'll never stop talking about the single polities per se. Naturally, what is fascinating in this series is looking at the history of a given region from a deeper chronological perspective. We normally start with antiquity as well. We come to include part of ancient history to give a broader depth to the narrative. The historical region of Berry is located essentially between the Massif Central and the Sologne in the departments of Cher, Indre, and Allier, and extends into a gently rolling plain between the Massif Central and the Great Orléans bend of the Loire. Thus, a fairly sheltered place compared to others, if anything, because it lays in the very center of the very geographical and geometric center of the Kingdom of France. Right. By the end of the Middle Ages, you have all these various historical regions outlined, as you can see also from the maps that I inserted across the video. You have in the north Blois, as a matter of fact. Naturally, we'll see now the most important centers of Berry are Bourges. This is naturally a very important center, and Châteauroux as well. We talk about these, also considering the relative instability, in fact, of this land, at least as a whole domination continuum, right? There are various seigneuries that sort of start, especially at the higher levels, exchanging large parts of France for their dynastic strategies, etc. In the east, you have the county of Sancerre that basically separates with a very narrow corridor Berry from the county of Nevers. For a tiny trait in the north, Berry does border with the Duchy of Orléans. In the south, you have La Marche. In the southwest, the county of La Marche, the Duchy of Bourbon in the southeast. In the west, you have straightforwardly Poitou, with centers like La Tremouille, for example, and Touraine in essentially the northwest, with Loche being the closest center. Pretty close is also Châtellerault. However, there are also various territories that are historically recomposed under different seigneuries that here, as I said, are more important overall than the rest. In fact, actually, as we will see also in the video, the broader possessions of Berry will fall into the royal domains of the French crown. This by the end of the Middle Ages. The history is fairly ancient, as we were saying before, as Old Gaul. The name Berry comes from the very Celtic tribe known as the Bituriges in Latin, who inhabited the region during and before the Roman era. Numerous dolmens, in fact, are still visible today in Berry, testifying that the area was populated long before the Romans by a significant culture, with archaeological evidence from the Neolithic period, such as the dolmen of La Pierre-Levée near La Chapelle-aux-Boreilles, dating to approximately 4000 BC, indicating early agricultural settlements, by the way. And this is, of course, the area of France that whose description applies to the broader Atlantic plains, very rich, fertile soils. As you know, during the Bronze Age, in fact, these areas are quite developed. Excavations, at least for continental European standards, of course, excavations at the site of Châteauneuf-sur-Cher have in fact revealed a settlement from around 1500 BC, with pottery and tools suggesting, of course, wide trade connections with the neighboring regions. This is also basically the period of broader Indo-European settlement. Berry was one of the centers of resistance against Roman conquest in the 1st century BC. Vercingetorix, in fact, attempted to resist at Avaricum, that is nothing less than modern-day Bourges, as you know, against Caesar's legions that gave a magnificent proof of Roman military engineering, capturing and sacking the town in 52 BC. Avaricum witnessed, as you know, the construction of 2 major ramps that allowed the Romans to storm the Celtic oppidum, displaying again this mastery in the art of war and just all the courageous stubbornness that only Rome at that point, in her vision and thirst of conquest, could so concretely achieve. Thus, the territory of the Bituriges falls under the Roman domination, during which numerous roads were further implemented. As we've seen, this was a rich agricultural area, at least rich for normal European standards. Therefore, several markets had developed, in particular, again, around these oppida that dominated the land in this proto-feudal Celtic reality. So the Celts had their own kind of highways that eventually were fully implemented and reinforced by the Romans that exploited the same road system that the Celts had established. In fact, paradoxically, that helped conquering Gaul to begin with, but it wasn't just because of the technology. It was because, as you know, France is very easy to control. Like in all times, like it may be politically difficult to control, socially different to control at some point, but not strategic, not militarily difficult to control. You have all these concentrated, all these various centers scattered at relatively, equal distances, well connected by roads with large supplies for forage in between. So this comes along at the turn of the first millennia with further a proper urbanization under Rome. The viatic system attests to the prosperity of the province already at that time. Excavations at Drevant, near Saint-Amand-Montrond, have uncovered a well-preserved Roman theatre from the 2nd century, capable of seating 3,000 spectators, witnessing to the intense Romanization, underscoring the region's cultural significance, By the way, there are very beautiful Roman theaters, amphitheaters, all across Gaul, sometimes in places that today are not immediately reconnected with any sort of major center, but that really shows the degree of Romanization. Gaul was the pride of Romanization outside of Italy, the greatest success of this great civilizational turn. A Roman villa unearthed at Argentomagus, modern Saint-Marcel, included intricate mosaics and a hypocaust system dating to the 1st century AD, indicating advanced domestic architecture. The hypocaust is essentially a system of hot air circulation below the floor of a room, right? And this was used for heating buildings in ancient Rome and other cultures. Of course, in winter, these areas are fairly fresh, let's say, and so the local inhabitants were also quite glad, especially the elite, to live in this established, tidy, and now also warmed place. In the late Roman period, the region of Berry constituted part of Aquitania Prima, where in the Diocletian subdivision of the older provinces. Aquitania here stands, of course, for a broader area that had come to encompass, in fact, also this deep Gallo-Roman hinterland. The capital of this province was still Avaricum / Bourges. Naturally, the Gallo-Romans suffer an important degree of barbarian movements across their territory. Its frontier position in the very center of Gaul, as we've seen, render it more exposed to such movements. In fact, nothing quite solid was established there for some time. There are some indications, if you want, of the current period in the videos I made about the Alans that had some garrisons scattered across the Gallic hinterland. Berry was crossed by the Vandal incursions. We are at the beginning of the 5th century. As you know, the Vandals made more or less a mess because they were to just cross, and so they mostly concentrated on ravaging. Naturally, as the whole region nearby, Berry came under Merovingian control, thus entering the broader Frankish world, and therefore remaining safely under also the Carolingian dynasty later on, who held the countship of Bourges until 928, right? So these were pretty central areas, and yes, again, they were also relatively peripheral to what would become the center of the French monarchy later on, right? But they're also not enormously endowed with some autonomous power, so they ended up more or less following the main trends. Little is known about Berry, for example, during the late Empire, or about the spread of Christianity in this region. Though a 5th century baptistery discovered at Bourges' Saint-Étienne Cathedral suggests early Christian activity, Gaul was a country of relatively old Christianization, and the local elites were somehow always in charge of that, passing from the senatorial to the episcopal times, and also in the blend with the Germanic aristocracy. I made a video about Merovingian, Carolingian geography. We talked about pilgrimage in medieval Gaul. There are, again, since Berry is very much at the center of France, the land carried much of this sort of symbolic role of crossroad. Clovis seized Berry so that the full completion also of the imperial Geist with the Gallo-Roman senatorial episcopal blend was fulfilled also in this area. Berry remains in one or another of the Merovingian king's branches during the many divisions of the Frankish kingdom, until it passed to the Carolingians that had temporarily reunited the world. The region was, however, fiercely contested. The late Carolingians, as early as in the time of Louis the Pious, the passage from him to his sons, to Charles the Bald, specifically to Louis the Stammer, all of them granted Berry as a county to one or another of their loyal followers until 928. Just the other day we were explaining how this system worked in the Frankish world, the vassalatic beneficiary practices. As you understand here, Berry is a district recognized again on the basis of the previous settlement of Bourges. That is really, it makes it an important, as we see, crossroad frontier stronghold. However, at this point, we're still witnessing a county. There is not yet vassalatic seigneurial spread outside with the accumulation of other districts. There was a county, a diocese overlapping, and that was. This area was also demographically relevant. For example, a Merovingian cemetery excavated at Chateau Meillan, containing over 200 graves from the 6th century, provides evidence of burial practices and material culture in the area, including glass beads and iron weapons, witnessing to pre-Christian burial practices, even in a Christian context, that would be soon sort of erased. Just Alemannia, it was not that far anyway, would maintain the practice of burying their dead in arms. Nevertheless, it shows to you that syncretic background that Gaul will represented at a crossroad again of the Celtic, Roman, and Germanic cultures. Immediately after 928, Berry fragmented. In the northeast, small fiefs emerged that quickly became vassals of the counts of Anjou or Blois-Champagne. So the department of Cher, and again, if you look at the map, you will realize how fundamentally the northern Loire seigneuries were more powerful and tied also to the monarchy in the Ile-de-France and Champagne. That the latter would seigneurially develop to the point of insinuating relatively close to Berry, and essentially skirting around Orléans, the Duchy of Nemours. If anything, we will talk about the latter, because you see with France there is always more than a seigneury to cover. It's strictly intertwined with one another, even when individually they weren't so, as we've seen, autonomously active. They still added to the broader feudal ratio of power. So Berry configurates itself as a county destabilized by the spread of local lordships that, as you know, in this period, after the end of the Carolingian Empire, that the Carolingians had been ruling up to this point, as you know, in up to the beginning of the 10th century in the Western Frankish kingdom, the local aristocracy does a bit like they want. This is not such a specifically stable moment, but if anything, what happens at a local level is the product of some local consolidation as well, not much more broader disarray. There is an organic coherence in the spread of these seigneuries. The southwestern part of Berry remained united under the Principality of Dole, in the department of Indre. This fell, as we've seen, given the location, into Aquitaine. It was a vassal of the latter. While the southeastern part of Berry definitely separated from Berry to form, along with other neighboring territories, the lordship of Bourbon in the department of Allier, and we've seen this in the video about the house of Bourbon for the same series. It ended up becoming more like the house than the actual ancestral land of Bourbon, given that this would become one of the most powerful and far-reaching high nobiliar houses of France. Nevertheless, the diocese of Bourges, in all of this, maintained its unity. This is really typical also of the political landscape. Bishops maintain a firm control over their church within the city walls, and they contribute to reinforce, in fact, the centrality of the urban center, the surrounding countryside. Also in a time, as you know, of invasions. Here there are the Normans, the Magyars even. The city solidified its role as the political authority center of Berry, as it would essentially go on in history, like with the appointment in particular of this authoritative figure, the Archbishop Gozlan, in 912. This strengthened ecclesiastical governance and sanctioned this direction in the history of Berry. A charter from 920 records the Saint Gozlan's endowment of land to the monastery of Saint-Sulpice in Bourges itself, reinforcing the church's influence in a patrimonial and just also spiritual sense. We get this information, by the way, from the Cartulaire de Saint-Sulpice. Just the other day I was talking about diplomatics, Mabillon. That video, for some reason, you didn't watch. I don't know how you evaluate the historical relevance of my content, but that was very bad to miss to begin with. Naturally, monasteries, as we know, also from the same Paris, think about Saint-Germain, Saint-Denis, Saint-Geneviève, etc., were part of this sort of strongly urbanized landscape for high medieval standards. Again, France, as Western European country, strongly Romanized, rich, right, powerful, with a very solid feudal glue already starting to grip like these territories, is of course mirrored as such by the endowment of the local church of different foundations that in this case reflected the rising power of the bishop. Right, they had more wealth rather than keeping it in their treasure and having lay authority becoming more competitive. It augmented clienteles, right, and allowed also the secular church in the 10th and 11th century to strengthen its grip, at least through the spread effect of such monastic communities, right? Because at large, through the feudalization of the entire system and the increasing power of the lay lords, bishops, especially towards the latter end, began to lose ground, especially in a country like France that was at the apex of lay power development. We often confuse the relative fragmentation of France, or actually what was the greatest fragmentation of France in post-Carolingian countries, as a form of, it's politically fragmented, so it means it was weak. Not at all. It was politically fragmented because it had much more local power spreading from everywhere, right? Different from other places that needed to confederate to a degree because they didn't have enough surplus to pursue locally their own careers. So France witnesses, of course, a big deal of secular ecclesiastical support towards the nobility, towards the monarchy, and things start working concretely also because the same church is further backed and by the private investment of the nobility through monastic foundations. In fact, this is also the time, and it's also relatively close in place to the spread of the Cluniac reforms that witnessed this congregation, as you know, like taking over great part of Western Europe in terms of sheer power, starting from Cluny. That admittedly is 180 kilometers away. I mean, France is actually big, but in the neighboring Burgundy, if you cross the Loire, you enter that plus that broader context that is pretty close, in any case, to this one. Consider also the communications of the times, how these monasteries had become the connective fabric of post-Carolingian Europe, and how, regardless of the difficulties on the roads, the brigands, as we've seen, foreign murderers and so on, there was a pretty strong and consistent connection of these centers that became also very well in place. Again, France eventually follows like a civilized development. So yes, there were wars, but there were wars within a civilized space that protected the monasteries. The papacy was increasing its control on the same. Berry has one characteristic: it's the notable birthplace of several kings and other members of the French royal family. Even though they weren't particularly connected with Berry per se otherwise. Berry was also the birthplace of the knight Baudouin Chauderon, who fought in the First Crusade. This is a local hero. At the end of the 11th century and during the 12th century, the archbishops of Bourges, under the leadership of Richard II, 1071-1097, managed to have all the parish churches of the diocese handed over to the Benedictines, less often to the Augustinians, and almost never to the secular clergy. This speaks, again, volumes about what we were talking about before regarding the subcontracting of even the parish system, in this case, down to the lowest echelons of the ecclesiastical hierarchy to monastic entities. Technically, everybody's a Benedictine at this point, but there are just new congregations that are emerging as well. And this was naturally not overall a negative dynamic for the land. The circumstance, in fact, fostered the spread of Romanesque art in Berry, exemplified by the intricate carvings, for example, at the Abbey of Saint-Benoît-sur-Loire, completed around 1108. The Abbey's crypt, constructed under Abbot Gozlan himself, contains rare 11th century frescoes depicting biblical scenes. In the 12th century, following renewed spiritual fervor, Fonteriste, Grandmontagne, and Cistercian orders settled in the area. With the establishment of Noirlac Abbey in 1136 as a major Cistercian foundation. The Cistercians, as you know, were specializing in land exploitation. They were quite advanced in agronomy and in horse breeding. They were the ones responsible for sending great part of the Crusader war horses to the Holy Land to protect the Outremer states against the Saracens. You can imagine all the connections here. There were naturally different presence of monastic military orders. Politically wise, Berry, that still maintains a relatively low profile, as we explained, as a local potentate, politically entered the Capetian orbit in 1101, when Philip I of the Western Franks acquired the Viscountcy of Bourges. The Viscounts were essentially these seigneurial, in fact, on behalf of the Count, governors, rulers that emerged historically from different directions. Mostly there was, in fact, a Count that delegated somebody to work instead, especially in some different scenarios. It could be anyone, really. The term gives the name to different families in Europe, including the most famous Visconti of Milan. Sometimes were even not noblemen, in fact, or aristocrats. I mean, sometimes most of the times actually they were, but it could be just like, this was like a ministerialis, like in the German case, that remained free because his lord died, his line went extinguished, and he found himself just with this de facto comital power in his hands, or this local lordship that he passed down by custom and habit. That's also why these titles could, for example, pass to, like in this case, to the king of the Western Franks themselves. 1101 is a relatively early time, by the way. And it's fascinating in this sense that, before the Battle of Bouvines, 1 century away from that, the Capetians had an important reach already in the very geographical center of France. And so wedging a bit between the duchies of Orléans and of Burgundy, passing through Auxerre, Saint, etc. Blois as well. I made videos about these. By the way, if you're interested, we can check them better out in other videos, but you already have this. It's the original one. This ties Berry from an early age to the crown of France. From 1152, however, with the marriage of Eleanor of Aquitaine to Henry Plantagenet, Berry was actually absorbed into what essentially was the broader domain, the extended domain of the same holders of the English crown, right? Aquitaine, after all, and so as we've seen, this was close, and it becomes a broader term, right? Aquitaine was just the original duchy. We made a video about that as well. Or better, I think I made the video about medieval Aquitaine that is considered just this entire, as huge, but still very fragmented, south, central, western part of Gaul. That first is sort of tied with the marriage of Eleanor to the king of the Western Franks, Henry VII. They eventually divorced, and as you know, she married Henry II of England, giving birth, among the others, to Richard Lionheart, John, so-called Lackland. This is relevant because, as we've seen, Berry was a bit in between the sort of areas of political and cultural influence in France of the time. As a frontier area, it suffered partly of this kind of back and forth of dynasties, of authorities, and so on. There are broader spheres of influence. Sometimes the Capetians can't reach as far as Berry. It's already a big deal if, in all the wars they fight against the Normans, for example, they can't concentrate any power toward other than toward that direction. This passage is fascinating because Berry, for a while, another couple of generations, and the ultimate victory of Bouvines remains into Plantagenet's hands. Right. Naturally, this was held by various titles as a fief, in any case, to the King of France that controlled the entire, even Aquitaine as such, but in particular with this tension, given that the land had already been purchased, literally, at least the Viscountcy of Bourges, the most important center, by the St. Capetians back in the day. And so there were various agreements and negotiations about this, but underscoring the deep conflict and competition between the two sides. With the Treaty of Goulet in 1200, Philip Augustus had John Lackland cede the rights held in Berry by the Dukes of Aquitaine and the Counts of Anjou. As you know, there is a bit of back and forth and coming back of the St. John. That's why until Bouvines, basically, the situation is not really consolidated. But this is the formal act through which Philip II of France regains control of Berry. And out of this frontier issues and antagonism, if you're interested in the Battle of Bouvines, I just recently made a video on top of the one about the battle itself, the usual tactical analysis regarding the deployment of the armies at Bouvines. In 1221, the seigneuries of Châteauroux in the west and Issoudun were annexed into the Duchy of Berry. And this had been elevated properly as such, with the castle of Châteauroux itself fortified by 1225, so you see in the southwest of Bourges, to secure Capetian control from that side. And so Châteauroux, by the way, increases in power at this point as a fortified settlement, as a castle, as a fortress. A surviving tax roll from 1223 details the contributions of the Saint Châteauroux merchants to the same fortification efforts, indicating a structured local economy, and of course some Capetian investment through the cooptation of the third estaters, as you know, also in this broader subcontracting of the royal administration, especially more distant places. This was naturally, as a document, just mirroring the obvious costs required to the merchants that were given something in exchange, but to provide, given that there were people with the hands in most things there, the kind of material, manpower, etc., to reinforce the fortress of Châteauroux. This frames Berry also in a pretty sheltered dominion that is the one of the grandeur of the Capetian dynasty, especially from Philip II to Philip IV. France is de facto the strongest, the biggest power in Europe, with the exception actually of Sicily up to that point, as we've seen with that video about the royal income at some point, but Sicily does not last long united, at least in this picture. And it's the apotheosis of feudalism, it's the apotheosis of chivalry, it's the apotheosis of also an imperial Catholic model that the Capetian dynasty embodies also, for example, with Louis IX, true veritable sainthood, right? There are wars actually during this period, but Berry is pretty much spared from most of them. They hadn't suffered the ravages of Occitania. They had, as we've seen, been fundamentally controlled, but as the cornerstone of geographical France by the Saint Capetians early on. They had been reinforced with the Châteauroux. However, Berry will be affected by the 100 Years' War. Right off the bat, during the early phase of this contrast, Berry was taken and devastated by the English. We are after Poitiers, after Crécy, back in time. So this is one of those areas that, although controlled by the Capetians, they're not quite so close to the actual center of power of the French crown. Also, they were relatively sacrificable. And the Anglo-Gascon chevauchés do affect very much the landscape. With the Peace of Bretigny in 1360, Berry was actually returned to France, to the French kings, in as much as, again, the English couldn't quite control directly this territory. As far as that, again, it was pretty close, at least from their perspective, to the heartland of French power. So at that point, the king bestowed Berry as a duchy upon his son John. When the country, after further devastation, was cleared of the further English incursions in 1371, because there were numerous, as you know, free companies that somehow were controlled by the English and were just looting for the sake of it after they had fallen out of employment. The new Duke of Berry settled in his castle in Bourges because this had become safer than, paradoxically, what had been established as the strongest avant-post in the previous century in Châteauroux. That naturally does not automatically get updated 150 years later. At this point, there are firearms. There is, if anything, also a deeper political crisis than it had been back in the day. This is a moment of collapse of civilization for the world after the Black Death with all these ravages, etc. And so, while in the late 12th century, the Capetians were gradually mounting in power, at this point they are withdrawing, and Bourges as a bigger center becomes a bit the safer place where to rule Berry from. War soon returned, and Berry was ravaged once again, this time by both the Armagnac, that were allies of the same duke, and the Burgundians. Given that war was properly waged across the territory, and so both armies, both sides, the Armagnac and the Burgundians were essentially the two factions. The first one in favor of essentially the crown, the Burgundians, again, mostly siding with the English. And however it goes, if you find in one of these lands, and especially it's not so central, as we've seen the geography of France, there is going to be pretty bad stuff going on. Throughout the 14th century, and so the 100 Years' War, the region became a battleground of preference in that sector between France and England, achieving moments of relative political independence as a consequence, especially under the Dutch of John Jean starting in 1360, where, as we've seen, this territory had been subcontracted with its ducal title. John was a patron of arts as well, and so paradoxically there is some space for a revival and for artistic development, even through this area, this moment of crisis, which is really telling also a bit of later medieval history, and again, it's humanistic and toward Renaissance kind of attitude. It's an ever more elite game, even more in France, considering that it was the most sort of elite feudal land out there. In 1416, Berry returned to a more direct crown control, in particular to the Dauphin Charles VII, that in fact was known, given the fact that he had to succeed to his mentally unstable father, as the de facto king, say, of France, but known as King of Bourges, as he was ruling from there. Charles VII, and we made videos about him, was the one who successfully ended the war at some point. Subsequently, with the shift of political primacy to the Loire Valley and Paris, Berry quickly declined once again. Telling the truth, Paris had been a pretty unsafe place for the Saint Kings that from that moment onward began mostly to reside in the various castles of the Loire. That's also why essentially the siege of Orléans. And so Berry was close, and it witnessed all these upheavals of the later war. I also made a video a couple of months ago about the French nobility revolts. We have looked at the Praguerie. So these are revolts from the 15th century. It's the first one. The other is the War of the Public Weal and the Guerre Fou. They decreased in danger, right? So in threat, in damage to the crown. The first one, the Praguerie, that was taking the name after the degenerate Hussites and their brutal violence and destruction of their own country in Bohemia, took place in 1440. This is the typical scenario where the French crown has managed to, especially after the siege of Orléans, to recover basically the upper hand initiative against the English and the all those noblemen that had mostly sided with them in France. First of all, the Burgundians, then the Bretons, etc. So the Praguerie broke out as an actual war against the possessions of the crown, led by nobles, including the same son of Charles VII, the future Louis XI, that had taken refuge at the House of Burgundy. I made a video about him also in that early phase, and this video in fact partly entwines with the one about the Dauphiné, as Louis was actually the only true Dauphin to rule from the Dauphiné at any point in French history. For the rest, it remained just a name, a name really. Naturally, the Dauphiné is not that close to Berry. It's actually in the southeast of France, so at least Berry is quite central, that is at the outskirts. But it still had a connection with this because part of the Praguerie, and so the connection with the same Dauphin were organized in Berry itself, highlighting its role as a hub of political dissent. A letter from Charles VII, dated 1440, addressed to the lords of Berry, orders, in fact, the suppression of rebel strongholds in Vierzon. This is preserved, a letter preserved in the National Archives of France, that illustrate how Berry had become a hotbed of revolt, and there were proper enemies of the crown, Charles VII, that had tried to unhinge, in fact, royal control from the duchy. This was quite important because there was a direct lineage here involved. As we've seen, the Duke John of Berry, also known as the Magnificent, the one after which the famous Très Riche Heure, the Duc de Berry, in fact, were created, mostly from the magnificent illumination, worth of that higher nobility that you see, mostly also in the pictures that are filled with the Très Riche Heure, but not only. We're looking at essentially the son of John II of France, and after his death, Charles VII, as we've seen, was coping with the Praguerie later, before he became actually king, had reconquered Berry inch by inch, right, driving out the English during one of the most difficult phases of the 100 Years' War, like especially at the time following Azincourt and before the siege of Orléans, so there is the loss of Paris, right? So this is pretty dramatic time. So it's obvious that Berry had come to acquire, if anything, a symbolic relevance, but also a strategic one, a logistical one, a political one, a moral one. So much so that in this time, Berry held also particular importance as it became the center of French national resistance, and or at least one of the few areas that the French monarchy retained control on under the onslaught of the English and the Burgundians. And as we've seen, again, Orléans is just a bit north of Bourges. Orléans, by the way, is on the right bank of the Loire. Bourges is on the opposite one. And if you look at the map of Berry, you know that the Loire basically at Orléans peaks, sort of the northernmost point, which is even northern than Nantes, for example. And then it goes south, right? It starts in Massif Central, and Berry is somehow enucleated. On the other side, there is, in the north, there is Blois. That, of course, is quite crucial in that as well. I made a video about the Count of Blois. But it's so important as the last resort of the last resorts, even though, again, Bourges is not Orléans. And so had Orléans fallen, at that point, the Valois would have had sort of very tough time to recover much from Berry alone. The reason why Berry, however, became a center of French national resistance was not just the fact that it was the hinterland to this land controlled by the crown, but because the inhabitants had somehow gained a certain pride of being connected with the same king. Not all of them, as we've just seen, were favorable to King Charles VII, though. The moment of the Praguerie, if anything, where things had largely been settled with the 100 Years' War. Bourges, where the king resided at the point, stood in opposition to Paris. Then it had fallen in English hands, so it was a bit of this, new center, new possible floating center of the monarchy amidst all these upheavals. Besides, the University of Bourges was a very important institution, founded fairly late in 1463, but became a center for legal studies, attracting scholars like Jacques Curias in the 16th century. I talked about this in the video about the Mos Gallicus. If you're interested in that, we address Curias, and we also talk about Bourges. A manuscript from 1470 housed in the municipal library of Bourges itself records the university's statutes, detailing its curriculum focused on Roman and canon law in particular. This is really typical of the year, in as much as Roman law was spreading as basically the new common law. So as far as lay matters were concerned, from Italy, and France would basically adopt it with just sort of its own vibe, its own character. Canon law was fundamental, as France had been the the center of theological studies. And so obviously those interconnected with lay ones. We were talking about it just the other day, in fact, in that video about it was not yesterday because I record just at different times, but I mean the one about the history of medievalistics, and then Mabillon to Masson. And so the interest towards ecclesiastical history that, especially in countries like France, was, while heavily subordinated, of course, to broader monarchy, was nevertheless, in fact, a bit of a continuation and an obvious aspect of the Saint. So, as far as the university itself was concerned and its connection with the French crown, of course, this legal focus is not it's not random, and canon law was foundation of the same ecclesiastical matters. Louis XI gave the Duchy of Berry to his brother Charles, but took it back when the Duke joined the League of the Public Weal, that, as we've seen, was the central rebellion. It was a bit less sort of impacting, but it was a serious deal as well. Thus, the duchy returned to the crown. Once again, Louis had to, again, content part of his family, including his brother, that naturally was very much mobbed by the rebelling nobility, in as much as they thought that he could, in fact, because of his blood, overthrow his brother and at some point even become king in exchange, naturally, for something for this nobility and their decentralizing autonomistic policy. But the rebellion failed. And Louis came back exercising his authority harshly, suppressing, for example, the local municipal autonomies of Berry that eventually had sort of sided with St. Charles in that ducal role, and that therefore had not remained so loyal to the crown in general later on. And this naturally reflects as a shift of allegiance, the increasing power of the crown that had come to, in fact, ever more effectively uniform, like the control over the same country, to an extent that was unavoidably reducing the local autonomies. As far, I don't know, as the aristocracy establishment in Bourges was concerned, it was mostly about having a ducal court there. As long as this duchy remained somehow more autonomous from the crown, would attract new wealth and co-opt the local families and so on. Realized the king's brother and the most, sort of the closest to the throne, at least in dynastic succession, is a big deal. The municipal autonomies were, however, restored in 1484 to, in fact, co-opt the same local establishment at the time of the regent Anne de Beaujeu, who, as you know, was ruling on behalf of her brother. And since at this point there was no major antagonist in Bourges, she tried to get the sympathies of the city by granting more autonomies. Naturally, this was also a relative proof of weakness, given that, again, this was the time of the Guerre Fou, right, that eventually witnessed the umpteenth monarchic victory, so the recompaction of France as the largest power in the West was not really much of something that you could prevent. And power, unitary power, there is a single monarch. It's not like Spain will become more powerful to an extent, but because it's the sum of different kingdoms at the same time. So, and possessions or overseas. And France has this incredible force concentration that helps a big deal. This is thus a moment of general, smoothing of relations. Berry was given as an appanage to various members of the royal family after this time. In 1498 to Joanne of Valois, then to Margaret of Alençon, the sister of Francis I. She was very important because at the time she was married with the Alençon, then she married into Navarre, and she would be in fact the grandmother of Henry IV of France, right? Because her daughter was Jeanne the Third, was Queen of Navarre because of the Albret connection. So it's an important line. Later, Berry was also given in appanage to Margaret of Valois, not the homonymous daughter of Henry II, but the sister of Henry II. In fact, Margaret of Valois, known as the Duchess of Berry, and in fact, wife of Emmanuel Philibert of Savoy, and so eventually her issue will rule in the House of Savoy. And their ancestors were Savoyards anyway. As you know, in the French line, they had often married with Piedmont. Berry was not really much the place of residence of these women. This was a land mostly given in appanage to them, meaning that they disposed of the income from this land. This tells you, of course, the enormous wealth of the French royals, even through the parcelization what you get, an appanage from Berry. And these are just, well, of course, these are very important women in the House of France, but it gives you an idea of the prestige, the power that they had. However, not such a bad news for Berry, because even though these women, these princesses, did not reside there, they entrusted the duchy to capable administrators. Berry is also known for an illuminated manuscript produced in the 14th-15th century that we were mentioning before, and that is so beautiful just to watch. Les Très Riches Heures du Duc de Berry, commissioned by John, as we've seen before, Duke of Berry, and completed, however, by the Limburg brothers around 1412, 1416. And this beautiful manuscript is now housed in the Musée Condé in Chantilly, right? So not there. The Limburg brothers, were some Dutch miniature painters, Herman, Paul, and Jean, that were active in France and Burgundy in the early 15th century, working in this international Gothic style. And again, their masterpiece is indeed the Très Riches Heures du Duc de Berry. But there is also the Belle Heure of Jean de France, Duc de Berry, that is also beautiful, but the former is really amazing. And again, on a video about medieval Berry, you're gonna get lots of pictures about this, as you've seen. There is a lesser-known manuscript as well, The Hours of Margaret of Orleans, produced in Berry around 1430, and it features similar artistic techniques and is preserved at the Bibliothèque Nationale de France. Berry was properly reunited with the crown, so becoming an appanage of the same upon the death of Louise of Lorraine, that was the widow of Henry III. From then on, the title of Duke of Berry became purely nominal, as we've seen in other videos, for example, the same Dauphiné. So in that case, it was a distinct appanage. Here, it basically got merged into the crown possession. And so this is typical of the later Capetians, particularly the Bourbon, as it was the Duke of Berry was a title held among others by Louis XVI, King of France, which was Louis Duke of Berry, even as the monarch, again, because they had all the titles under the kingly one, and Charles Ferdinand, the second son of Charles X. So we're even after the French Revolution. As you know, there was partial restoration of those older feudal titles. This was, however, a bit like the little story of Berry that you can find on Schwerpunkt. And again, I'm always glad to make videos of this kind because, as I said in other videos, it's actually very difficult to make a straightforward history of France. I've been struggling to do so. I mean, starting from medieval history, as the channel most revolves around that, it's relatively easy, of course, to cover all these various seigneuries, etc. It's not something you find very easily done anywhere else. And these videos are a bit shorter because, again, you could load this with information. But it's also important to just look at the country, the land, through this kind of filter, through the single elements that very often also in French history are a bit left aside, meaning rightly we study the history of France through the history of kings. But as you know, that has become also a bit rare. So paradoxically, in Schwerpunkt, we have made more videos about the various regions within not just the Kingdom of France, but also medieval France. Because as you know, some lands were also gradually eroded from the Holy Roman Imperial control, passing under the kings of France's possession, with lots of sort of international juridical embarrassment. But at the time, the Germanic emperors didn't really have the capacity to intervene on the Western frontier. So we ended up making a very strange mix of types of videos that may seem a bit random and do not follow especially the kingly story. So perhaps for France we should start some kind of kingly succession, and or talking about different kings depending on who they are and what kind of sort of story we can tell step by step for them all. This is, again, we've successfully done it with England. We can definitely do it for France. This is the 109th medieval French history video that I make. Medieval England, we have 61. So we should definitely do more. And I know it's fairly complicated to do so in a neat and tidy way. France is bigger, so admittedly the proportion I think is relatively considered. But again, about these countries, also a bit about Germany, we really lack a lot of that sort of thicker coverage that I think countries like this really deserve. So I don't know how we can operate in this regard. I honestly don't know even from you exactly whether you like more the military historical content or this more local one. I mostly feel that through the pulse of the views. So how many views I make, and then I decide. Naturally, Schwerpunkt has become a pretty big channel content-wise, where you can, at this point, really search for many things that are actually intertwined, right? I see here, by the way, we have something in common on medieval France. Is going to be pretty interesting. Hopefully next week, if everything goes as planned with the schedule. I see, because here I see all the various videos that we produced, and you see here it just an accident almost, because there isn't too much straightforwardly about medieval France out there. And this is, again, really, really a pity, because we must talk more about French history. There's nothing to do. It's more important than so many others. It's so crucial. It's so central. We'll see. All right. But adding Berry to the equation naturally helps, because it allows exactly this kind of paving for the further content. So again, I think it's fairly relevant, and we can go with it pretty straightforwardly. It's become really a challenge sometimes, not to choose the videos paradoxically or better, yes, but because there are so many options right now. Like, we didn't have so much of an option in the past years. Here we really have. I'm planning, for example, to make more French warfare of the French wars of religion. There was a very big warfare. It's radically underestimated. So we will get there. Also, French warfare during the Italian wars, absolutely. More about the age of Louis XIV, about the 18th century, about the French Revolution. I mean, yeah, we really have to. The Napoleonic era, it never ends. We're making something about the Crimean War, where the French were a bit the spearhead of the coalition against the Tsarists. So gradually, and this doesn't have to become merely anecdotal, right? On Schwerpunkt, I like really to glue together so many different topics that end up fundamentally being the product of some higher cultural vision rather than some random approach to the same, right? Again, I think that is crucial, and it should always be appreciated for such. Like, we make organic history. The purpose is for our history to be that organic and really meaningful in its approach to the entire world, so that if you want to know entire French history in some detail, well, you can go on Schwerpunkt and find that. All right, find all the kind of indications that you want. I'm trying to do so. Let's hope to stick to that adequately. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.